Okay, React data fetching. I'm going to talk about the current landscape of data fetching for React apps. This is still a pretty emergent space, even though a lot of really smart folks have been working on this for a couple of years now. For folks that don't know me, I'm Nichols Griggs. I'm in the New York office. And hopefully we'll be able to get some Q&A after this as well for people's questions and responses. But okay, I'm going to jump right into it. The React engine is mostly just a dependency management paradigm. I'm assuming most people have used React or know what React is. But so the way it works is strict control of dependencies is how it can tell, how the React engine can tell React DOM or React Native when to recompile your display. That's the game in React. Props, context, depth arrays are all concepts central to understanding React and how it does what it does. And the problem with dependencies is they may or not be instantly available. They may need to be fetched from a server. And so async operations presented synchronously. That's most of the complex work you're doing on a React application. Be they querying for data or handling user-generated events, the component always returns something back, even if it's just a blank screen. APIs have the luxury of patient users. Browsers and phone apps do not. React components can't throw errors, they can't return promises, they must always be returning synchronously because the user is always watching. And suspense and concurrency mode, those will be React's methods for allowing async components, but it's been delayed many times. They've been talking about it for, I think, 3 years or something, 3-4 years. Instead, the community's come up with its own solutions. Facebook has Relay. SWR has been around for a while. That stands for stale while reloading. It's maintained by Versal. Urkel, or Universal React Query Library, is maintained by Formidable Labs. And I'm going to talk about the three on the left: Apollo Client, React Query, and Redux Toolkit Query. I selected these three in part because of their popularity, but also because they're distinct from one another. Reading from the React Query docs, React applications do not come with an opinionated way of fetching or updating data. This is an extremely common complaint about React, and this can cause big problems in medium to large projects. So here's the most basic way of fetching data in React app. A controller makes a query to a server for data. Once the promise is fulfilled, it shoves that data or the error into local state. It defines a load, a data, and an error interface. And the reader body and the render body uses those load data and errors to return the appropriate visual, be they the load presenter or the user presenter, or the error presenter, or some combination of the two. And so if we just had two copies, two instances of this component, React's one-way data binding, because of React's one-way data binding, our components cannot easily share that data with one component above or adjacent to it in the render tree. Data can go down, but it can't go sideways, it can't go up. Multiple components who query are unaware of each other. They can and likely will make duplicate queries. And the browser back button is also not guaranteed to work well in this scenario. You'll never be able to go back to a page. You'll only be able to reload it. And preventing memory leaks has to be solved at every single call site. Testing is difficult because there's no standardized way to simulate a pre-populated local cache. I personally have run into this problem many times in React patches. So a query client places the fetcher and the cache at the top of the React render tree. And this enables it to be all known. Identical requests can be deduped. The cache is easily manipulated for tests. And we have the freedom to say whether the cache data is fine, or after a post request needs to be updated with a return created record, or it should be pessimistically reloaded, whatever the case is. Queries can even be auto-canceled on unmet, which is really useful. By use of the context API, we've now created a dependency tree that plays very nicely with React. That last part is crucial. Unlike caching mechanisms in, say, Axios, those libraries expose the cache to React state, so components automatically understand when they need to re-render. You're allowing the cache to be part of the dependency tree in your React app. So that's the high level approach of what all these libraries are doing. So I'm going to dig into the Apollo client right now, not the Apollo server. That would be a different talk, just the Apollo client. So the most commonly used values in the return object for Apollo use query are loading, data, and error. The loading Boolean signals if a promise is in flight. This alone with nullable data and error objects covers most scenarios of, do I have the data that I need to present? Am I waiting? Did something happen where my query was wrong or the server crapped out, whatever. These three things cover just about, let's say like 80 to 90% of the scenarios. And here's what this might look like in practice. The user query hook is called up top to one line. It's given a pre-constructed GraphQL query string, and variables are passed in a config object. At bottom, a three-pronged return control flow is set up, with line 7 being our happy path. What's key here is that your presenter is only ever called with data, which allows for much simpler writing and testing. You can write presenters that assume that the data is already there, like figuring out how to get the data is not in its purview. And the amount of signal you can get from these three-pronged presentations is so valuable. Beyond the value to the user of a self-healing presentation layer, it really helps the iteration process for everyone on the team to embrace this pattern really early. Like, you get a very obvious error prompt when something goes wrong while you're deving, which is just as useful to you as a dev as it is to your QA team or to your product team or to your users. And here's, oh, hold on a second. Oh yeah, cool. But our three values are in actuality independent from one another. So we should be handling combinations of these variables. Much of front-end deving these days is hiding this logic puzzle from the user. So your implementation might look more like this. The query is the same, but now errors are presented independently. A card component will preserve space for the data visualization and show some loading animations while the query is in flight. Sorry. Sorry. I'll just quickly call out the pattern here. So hooks are up top, starting at line 1. Translation of state is in the center, starting at line 5. There it is. And returns are at the bottom, starting at line 8. This pattern will repeat across just about all of your components in modern React. Just leave this up for a second. Okay, so back to use query in our basic state. Imagine a scenario where you have data loaded, you're already presenting it, but the user is asking for an update. You want to let them know that you're working on it. Do I have data or not is not a satisfactory answer. Is the component reinitialized, or are we responding to a refresh request? And Apollo knows this situation can arise, so it exposes an enum called network status. It's the original value the loading boolean is derived from. Loading and error are simple to understand. Ready means no promises in flight, and the previous promise was not rejected. Set variables, fetch more, refetch, and poll are similar to loading to provide more signal to why Apollo is refetching. Now if data is populated and status is refetch, we have all the pieces of info we need to present our refetch alert without unrendering the data we have been presenting. I can show that right here. But to get any of these Apollo goodies, we need to be using GraphQL. And GraphQL is not always your first choice for some products. And Apollo just may not be available to you. To use Apollo, you must use GraphQL. And if you're not using GraphQL, you can't use Apollo. It's not even an option. So enter React query. It doesn't care what kind of API you use. Any product made with React can use React query. Here's our queues: use query return values. They're really similar to Apollo because they're both solving the same problem. Here's an example of a use query call. It's a bit more reactive in Apollo. You have a tuple-like array as your first argument, the query key name, and the current key value, which allows React Query to look for prefetched data and know when query params have changed. Apollo also tracks ID keys, but because you're hooking up only one GraphQL endpoint, it can be done on the client level. And React Query gives you the freedom to call out to any API, so it must be done at the call site. You may like one approach over another, but both strategies are easily encapsulated into a one-liner for use in your component. And so the second argument is an async function that will either resolve with your data or throw an error. Axios or GraphQL query are what they're expecting you to use here, but you can use any fetch client you want. So React Query also has a lot of features. Apollo has most of these as well. Most of these features revolve around the idea that the server might not be friendly to the client. I think we've trained ourselves for so long that the client cannot be trusted. I think people often gloss over the fact that the server cannot be trusted either. It might be slow, so you want to prefetch or provide some placeholder data. Payloads may be huge and you need to be paginated. Data might become stale, and you may want to allow cache data to be cleared out after some length of idle time and just refetched whenever the window refocuses. That last one is extremely valuable for schedulers or e-commerce, and I don't believe Apollo currently supports it. It's tremendously useful just to like have an automatic refetch whenever the window refocuses. If you haven't tried Apollo or React Query, they're probably the most important React libraries to hit this in the last couple of years. And at this point, I know what you might be thinking. Say your Redux state looks something like this. After fetching projects, teams, tasks, and users, you're dispatching them to Redux for ease of distribution. You have some global style setting and some UI state for a sidebar there as well. So with React Query or Apollo, they're already caching and distributing loaded data. So none of these need to really go to Redux anymore. Suddenly you've chopped out 2/3 of your Redux license. If we're using a theme provider, then the theme is thrown out too. If you're building a true web app with lots of client state, say you had a photo editor or a WYSIWYG, Redux is still immensely useful for that. But the things that are worth promoting to Redux is becoming shorter and shorter. And that's been the trend for a while now. More purpose-built providers, fewer Redux slices. It's really common now for your app TSX to look something like this, which is a slew of context providers with your main router as a kind of chocolatey center. And so you may be wondering, maybe Redux is dead. No, it's not dead. So there's a big addition to Redux toolkit that just made beta. Actually, while I was writing this talk, it was still in alpha, and then last week I had to change all the slides because they went into beta. It makes it easy to find an API that's bound to Redux for storage. And from there, you can do everything you normally do with Redux. You let other reducers respond to calls, save to local storage with Redux persist, or use reselect or memorize data selection. And you can watch it all happen with the Redux dev tools. It's all the goodies that you would expect. And here's how creating an API is done right now. Again, this just went into beta last week, so the maintainers are confident this is what's going to get merged. You give your reducer a path name, a base query. The base query is right here, and then you start building your endpoints. And for folks who have made API clients from scratch, this will look super familiar, maybe even a little friendlier than before, or at least a little more structured. The fact that it builds type-safe React hooks for you is really killer. The API gets hooked up as middleware to your Redux storage, and you're done. That's it. I'm really excited to see what Redux Query gets to see Redux Query get merged into RTK. But I would still expect most products to use Apollo or more likely React Query. And I'll sort of go into the differences a little bit more just a bit. So testing, I'll just highlight the 3 differences between testing these 3 libraries because the testing, how you will write your tests is going to change very dramatically. So the Apollo team did the most work on this. They have a whole mock provider and mock cache that can be seeded at the start of your test. The big drawback here is that you pre-seed Apollo with the expected calls. And if your test makes any of those calls and they match, then the mock is used. And that means where the values provided didn't match, your test won't be able to tell you what values did not match. It's really frustrating. Your test just fails and you really don't have a clear understanding of why. And this could easily be improved by the Apollo team. Maybe they're already working on it, and it may happen in the future. But right now, it's a big frustration, even though I think probably writing React tests with Apollo mock providers, probably the nicest looking test I've ever written. There's still some work to be done there. React Query is the least opinionated about testing, and recommend you use a combination of React Hook testing library and mock. I don't really like this approach because it's too close to the metal, really. Testing that you set up RQ properly is kind of valuable, but not as valuable as testing the integration and seeing that your components are responding appropriately and using your cache when desired. And last, Redux is really fun to work with in tests, so long as you mock only what you intended to mock. The 2 approaches are either you create a test store, like you would a test DB, and see what happens to it, and then you can look at the DB and see like, okay, the shape is what I wanted this to turn out to be. Or if your component really doesn't care what happens to its actions, you simply mock dispatch and assert that the expected info was created, tagged, and sent. And it's really, really declarative when your tests fail. Like it's very clear as to what happened and why. You can compare your expected versus what you ended up with, which is really, really nice. So to sum up, React Query is a really powerful query client. And at this point, it's recommendable for pretty much any React project of medium to large size. It's also really small. It's only 40 kilobytes downloaded. If you happen to be using GraphQL, I think Apollo Client is an extremely powerful and stable option. It's the largest at 130 kilobytes downloaded. And we have many clients who have already gone all in on GraphQL. And so if you're working with a client that is doing all GraphQL on the back end, there's no reason why you wouldn't want to use Apollo for the front end. And whatever you think about the language, Apollo is very relevant to our work. It's very easy to use. It's the oldest of these three options, and it's certainly the most mature. And last, where you really want the manual control of Redux, or you want to take advantage of all the amazing Redux add-ons out there, very soon you'll have RTK query. We'll see post-release how much this adds to RTK, but I expect it to be even smaller than React Query, actually. Package size is kind of a little besides the point, though, because the savings and downloads these clients will give to your users is going to be much larger than 130 kilobytes. So it's almost like a kind of no matter what your situation is, using one of these libraries, you really don't need to worry about how much it adds to your package size. It's definitely going to be worth it. Just in the ability to use the back button appropriately and not have to refetch data and all that. So whatever your circumstances, if you're on a React project, I would at this point heavily recommend you consider one of these fetch libraries. They're really stable, they're heavily supported, they make testing much easier and much simpler than crafting even a simple solution on your own. I think one of the things that I've been waiting the most on is for React Query to sort of like get to the maturity level that Apollo Client has had, that I would actually recommend it to a client and use it in prime time. And I do think that it's there now. Again, RTK is not even merged yet; it's still in beta, so I wouldn't recommend anybody be using that on a project currently. But if you're curious about it, you can totally try it out on your spare time, and it's definitely like a competitor to all of these, even though it's using Redux. And another big benefit to RTK query that I forgot to point out was that Redux is still completely, framework agnostic. Like it doesn't care that you're using React; it could be used for Angular. It could be used in a server or something. It doesn't care. And so the ability to have a query system for Redux is going to be super duper valuable, even though I still think probably Apollo Client and React Query are going to be far more popular than that solution. And then again, Relay and SWR and Urkel are still out there, but I am not really seeing quite as much conversation about them or support. I know Relay came out like many years ago, and a lot of the community has kind of shied away from it for maybe just avoiding going all in on Facebook tooling or what, but Apollo Client and React Query have just shot up in popularity lately, and I think there's a very good reason why. Thanks, that's everything from me. Any questions? Let me open up my chat too so I can see that.
I don't see any, but thanks, Brian. That was awesome. And again, I think this recordings will be made available. So if people want or missed part of it or want to go back to part of it at some point, these will be available. And I think we're on break for 15 minutes until, and oh, Dylan has a question. Did I miss that?
Sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Dylan, I can hear you.
Oh, yeah, just real quick. I wanted to ask if you think any of this will change, like with suspense, like when suspense is.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. I haven't dug into it too much because I've kind of given up on suspense, and I'll be like, someone will tell me when it becomes relevant. But Redux Query has like a whole section of their docs actually for like what their strategy is going into suspense. And if you want to turn on suspense now in your app, which anybody can do, it's an experimental feature. You can the Redux Query team is absolutely considering like how query is going to fit into suspense mode. So that's will things change? Probably. Will they change immensely? I don't know. And I don't think any of these libraries would be flat-footed because they're already thinking about suspense mode and they're already like looking at how their library is going to be performing under suspense mode as well.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, the big benefit suspense is going to be giving, I think, is it's going to allow for error boundaries to be a little bit more declarative. And in that sense, I really wonder how that's going to play into these libraries, because these libraries are already like encapsulating and pushing like query errors into state. And so if you start adopting one of these libraries now, I think it's going to make it a little bit easier to understand suspense and what that's going to possibly do if you opt into that feature. But like they're both kind of scratching at the same problem, which is you want your app to like gracefully fail. And because Apollo client and React Query are already like wrapping and handling those errors for you, and then just pushing them into state, so your component can respond to them however you want to respond to them. Like that's already sort of being taken care of for you, which is really cool. But I think suspense is going to shake up that conversation a little bit, but probably not as much as you think.
Cool. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thanks, everybody.